Welcome once again. What is going to be the focus of our reflection together this time? Well, let's try these words from a book of our original wisdom, the Vedic tradition, a statement we find in the Upanishads. When the joys and sorrows of the other are my own joys and sorrows. My own joys and sorrows? Those words, that statement, sound so simple, yet it offers us the most enormous challenge, especially in our world today. A challenge, however, that if we can learn to live it, will bring us to a point where we can have the freedom to live in peace with each other. The real object of the reflections of this series, learning to find a new way, a way of peace and freedom in which we can live together on this earth. Now, the words have had to be translated from the original Sanskrit, and so translation into different languages always has the difficulty that we could miss the original meaning. So let's look at that a little more carefully. Are we talking about sympathy with the joys and sorrows of somebody else? Well, no, it's more than that. Sympathy in general is the word we use when we recognize and accept that the other is going through a period of sadness or a period of joy. We can send a card of sympathy expressing that we're sorry that the other person is going through the death of a loved one. But there's distance in sympathy between me and the experience of the other. I can recognize it, I can accept the experience, but it isn't mine. I'm not involved. There is another word we could use for the challenge that we could find in that statement, and that would be empathy. When the joys or the sorrows of the other generate or raise in us similar emotions, a similar experience, usually through the memories that I have of my own times of joy or sorrow. But actually, the word that fits best the challenge of that statement is compassion. The ability to experience with, to enter into the joys and sorrows of the other as they are for the other, and to experience them as my own joys and sorrows. Now, this is a profound challenge. The vital difference between the experience of sympathy and empathy lies in the fact that for compassion, there is no judgment about what actually gives the other joy or sadness. An acceptance that this situation, this object, can bring joy to the other. Can I enter into that joy that way? Let's try a very simple example that many of the women who are listening to this may have experienced themselves. You may live in New York or Sydney or Paris or Tokyo, one of the great economically sound metropolises of our world, and you know the sort of clothes that give you enjoyment, the clothes you liked to wear, the gift, some object, some gift some piece of clothing that you feel proud to wear, joyful to wear. Okay? But walking down the streets in your city, you suddenly see a woman wearing a burqa. That long, black, face-covering piece of clothing that spells for you a symbol for a social, cultural, religious tradition that is very foreign and doesn't really fit in your city. Perhaps for you it is the symbol of a culture that always condemns women as being inferior to men. And so you would find it extremely difficult to accept that this woman could actually enjoy wearing those clothes as much as you enjoy the dress or the coat or the shoes that you are wearing and want to wear and enjoy wearing. She has a choice, just as you have a choice. Compassion would be able to enter into the fact that she could really enjoy wearing a burqa, or be pleased and proud to wear a headscarf in the way that her culture or her tradition asks her to. Okay, go on, find your own resistances, your own examples. Compassion does not judge the source or the reason for the joy or sorrows of the other, does not evaluate them, can enter into the fact that she or he really finds joy in this situation. Be able to go in and say, yes, I could live that joy a little with her. Entering into the joys of another is not as easy as entering into the sorrows of another. So let's take a little look at entering into the pain and suffering of another. Just take pain, for example. We can have an intellectual grasp of the cause of physical pain of another. We can know that when this bit of the anatomy collapses, then the nerves are touched and also perhaps destroyed, and the result is pain. We cannot know what the other person is suffering that way. Suffering is completely individual, subjective. I remember a doctor I once knew who was training nurses in a hospital and made this point very clearly. There were people I knew, so he shared it with me, shared this experience with me. He pointed out to the nurses a particular ward or corridor with different rooms of intensive care in the hospital, which they all knew. And in room number 1 was a woman who'd had an extremely difficult operation and was not going to recover. She was heavily drugged, but at the same time experienced intense spasms of pain. He said that morning when he had knocked at the door and opened it, he'd said, "Well, how are you today?" And she looked up at him with a smile and said, "Doctor, I'm feeling fine. Thank you for all you're doing." And he said a few doors further down, there was a man who had undergone a very mild operation and was in fact making a wonderful recovery and would soon be out of the hospital. And he said he knocked at his door and walked in, and he said the same thing, "Well, how are you today?" And the man, almost before he could reach the bed, was shouting at him, "Doctor, the pain is terrible. I cannot go on like this. Can you not give me something else?" etc., etc. Pain, yes. The anatomy, the injury, an intellectual grasp. The suffering? Can we really enter into that of the other? This distinction between pain and suffering was very clearly outlined in the Buddhist spiritual tradition, and is extremely helpful for us when we're trying to understand compassion for the other. Joy, is joy also subjective? We'll take love, for example. You can say, I can enter into her thrill and her joy when he said to her, "I love you," because I've had the similar experience myself. And when somebody I love says, "I love you," I know the thrill. I can enter into that experience. But when she says, I can thrill at the words, "I love you," from this man, this greedy, selfish human being, or this terrorist, can I really enter into the fact that she can find joy in his love for her? Isn't it possible perhaps to evaluate, to give a value to the object of our love or our sorrow, or the other's love and sorrow, joy and sorrow, without rejecting the other's experience? It's important to reflect on this for a while, and those of you who have been following the series might like to go back to number 3, the one entitled, Am I My Brother's Keeper? Challenge, a great challenge from the experience of compassion. It requires a rediscovery and a new acceptance of the fact that we come from a common origin, and the enormous dignity of every human being. You know, it's quite clear that it is basically our refusal to accept that as human beings we all come from the same source that is at the root of the violence that we are experiencing in our human family today. Refusing that we all come from the same source leads to my wanting others to be inferior, not quite as acceptable as I am, not quite as holy as I am. Certainly racism in full flower. Nobody who is rejecting a person because of his race, the color of his skin, the place he was born, can really be accepting that we have one source for all human life. All human life, without exception. Somebody who's refusing this, to acknowledge this one source from which not only all human life has come, but all life and all non-physical life and all physical life, concrete life, in this universe has come, that one source. When we refuse to accept that, we refuse to accept responsibility. Responsibility for our planet, for our human family. We refuse to accept responsibility for the crisis of violence in which we are all suffering. So often I hear the phrase from people with roots in a religious tradition, why did God make evil? Why does God allow war? Why are we having to suffer pain and fear? This attitude, which comes purely from a rejection that each one of us comes from the same source, comes from, returns to. This attitude can only lead to more violence, refusing my humanity. Earlier we took a statement from Dom Helder Camera, a social activist, who said it would always lead us to washing blood off our hands with more blood, more violence. Choice. Let's look back at something else we were all very familiar with a few years ago. Here he is. A child's toy, a teddy bear, called Huggable. Well, yes and no. If you remember, Huggable was a robot. He wasn't designed as a child's toy at all. He was designed for a piece of very sophisticated research that had nothing to do with children and teddy bears. But the research led the researchers to realize that we could produce robots. Now, robots that do something very specific. We're used to the idea that we have robots that can do many things for us. You know, we have robots now that can go shopping with the old lady down the road and carry her shopping back to her home and open the doors for her and carry the shopping in. Wonderful. We have robots that can entertain people in retirement homes for older people. We have robots that can perform surgery very efficiently. This has been developing for some time. I think it was 2014 that a robot was able to perform, under the command of the surgeon, of course, was able to perform a most delicate operation for pancreatic cancer successfully. But robots have been used in delicate surgeries for some time now. We have robots that can land on planets in space, where, as the NASA expert tell us, we can save the lives of a human being by letting a robot descend into the unknown area first, so that human beings don't have to take the risk. Going back to Huggable, how has he developed? Well, robots could always do things for us, like very sophisticated operations, or very practical tasks like moving things from here to there, carrying things for us. But they really couldn't enter into our joys and sorrows. Can they? Now, Huggable has led to research that has produced robots that can respond to a limited but a very important range of emotional expressions and experiences, first of all in young children. So that when, let's call him Huggable anyway, when the child cries, Huggable is sympathetic and comes to comfort the child. When the small child laughs, Huggable laughs too and whittles. When the small child is lonely, Huggable will embrace it, and so on. A robot able to respond to human emotions. Now, there is a difference between the robot's response to the child's emotion and our ability to enter compassionately into the sorrows and joys of the other and make them our own. The choice is vital. Life or death. She chose to love me, or that love is valueless. The love of a robot is not the same thing as the love or compassion of a human being. There's much to reflect on in that very simple statement from our original wisdom. The strength of its challenge is really great. And I'm suggesting that in the month until our next reflection together, we all take time. Take time to reflect, not just once, but over and over again, on my reactions to all this. To see the truth about my own response, the truth about the violence within me, the sadness within me, the joy within me. To notice that perhaps my growth into unconditional compassion for the rest of my human family is very slow. And yes, this is what I'm challenged to. Because basically, if I don't accept this challenge, I haven't accepted the full dignity and the full responsibility for my dignity as a human being. Compassion can lead me to joy, and joy is the goal of life. We'll talk about joy next time we meet.